The ice bucket went over on the white marble, and the music died right behind it. Margot Whittaker knelt on the 41st floor, while cold water spread in a gray stain beneath 312 guests in evening clothes. A few covered their mouths. More of them raised their phones. Priscilla Voss stood over her and held the silver sparrow brooch high enough for the whole room to see. "Take a good look." This one came in through the service door, but her eyes went straight into other people's pockets. A bartender hired by the night. Margot said someone had put it in her apron pocket. Priscilla told her to shut her mouth. Then the head of security took hold of her left wrist and pulled her up. The pain ran from 3 fingers all the way to her shoulder. Her knees folded, and somewhere behind her a man laughed. Then she said it, calm enough to sound out of place among the small laughter. "Don't lift me by the wrist. Take the weight under the elbow." At the head table, Rafe Castellano was turning the stem of his glass between 2 fingers. He stopped, not because of her, but because of that sentence, which he had heard once before, on the night he could no longer feel the right side of his body. He looked down at the left hand carrying all of her weight, and saw a band of blue wool around that wrist, faded, frayed at the edge. The glass slipped from his hand, rolled once, and fell onto the carpet without breaking. The whole room turned. Rafe stood up and said her name. Margot lifted her head, and for 2 seconds her mouth opened with nothing coming out, because for 7 years she had lived by never letting anyone call her that. What no one in that room knew was that the brooch had never been the most valuable thing in it, and that the woman on the floor had recognized every one of them before the sun came up. If this story reaches you, leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to our channel to hear it all the way through. 13 hours earlier, dawn still hadn't broken, and Chicago was so cold that the steam rising from the ventilation pipes atop the low buildings climbed straight into the air like columns of smoke that refused to disappear. In a 1-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, Margot Whittaker stood in the kitchen, stirring cocoa with her right hand. The little saucepan had been dented on one side for years. She poured the cocoa into 2 mugs, one decorated with an elephant that had almost completely worn away, the other plain white porcelain, then set them both on the dining table beside the window. Outside, snow had gathered in a thin white border along the edges of the glass. She walked to the bedroom door and knocked twice against the frame, slowly and firmly, hard enough for the vibration to travel through the wood. Wesley sat up almost immediately. He was 9 years old, his hair sticking up wildly on one side, and the first thing he did every morning was squint toward the kitchen to see whether there was cocoa that day. He saw the steam rising from the 2 mugs and broke into a grin. Margot stood across from him beneath the ceiling light, letting the light fall across her face before she spoke. The boy had become so good at reading lips that many people who knew him didn't even realize he couldn't hear the way they could. "Sleep well?" she asked. He nodded, then held up 3 fingers and pointed toward the apartment downstairs. Ruthie Danvers was 76 years old, and claimed that no one in the entire building could beat her at chess, at least until last night. 3 games in a row?" Margot asked. Wesley nodded so hard that his hair stood up even more on the other side. She let out a long whistle, something he couldn't hear but could see in the shape of her mouth, and he burst out laughing. She placed the mug of cocoa in his hands, then sat in the chair across from him. The 3rd chair in the apartment had lost a leg during the summer, and they still hadn't replaced it because there were only 2 of them who ever sat there. Wesley took a sip, set the mug down, then slipped one hand beneath his thigh and pulled out a sheet of paper folded in half. He pushed it across the table with both hands, the way a child does when he knows with absolute certainty that what he is giving you matters. Margot opened it. On the paper was a hand, a left hand, drawn in colored pencil, with broad, uneven fingers, and on the ring finger and the 2 beside it, the boy had drawn them curled slightly inward. Across the back of the hand ran a pale brown line at an angle. Beneath it, he had written in crooked capital letters, the final word growing smaller because he had begun to run out of space: "The strongest hand." Margot stared at the drawing longer than she needed to. Then she looked up and asked whose hand it was. Wesley pointed straight at her without a second of hesitation, as though it were the most ridiculous question he had ever heard in his life. She smiled. She folded the paper into quarters, carefully following the old creases, then slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat, the one with the zipper, the pocket she used for things that weren't allowed to fall out. Ruthie arrived while it was still dark, carrying a plastic container filled with oatmeal cookies and her chess set. She removed her scarf, hung it from the hook as though she lived there herself, then looked Margot up and down. "Long shift," she said. "Wedding or something?" "Engagement party," Margot replied. On the 41st floor. Ruthie gave a small grunt. The higher people go, the easier it is for them to forget somebody. Still has to take the service elevator. Margot tied her hair back in a low ponytail and tugged the blue wool band around her left wrist a little farther down to keep it covered. 3 of her fingers were more numb than usual today. That was winter. It wasn't new. She kissed the top of Wesley's head, signed for him to remember his homework, and he signed back that he was going to beat Ruthie 3 more times. Outside, the wind coming off the lake swept along the rows of low buildings and slipped beneath the collar of her coat. Margot walked 4 blocks to the train station with both hands in her pockets and her head lowered. On the platform, yellow lights spilled over the salt scattered across the concrete. She took out her phone, an old one with a crack across one corner of the screen that she had covered with clear tape, and opened the message from the clinic. They had measured Wesley again the week before. He had outgrown his old hearing aids. The ear molds no longer fit properly, and the new set suited to a boy his age would cost $8,200. There was an assistance program, the message said, but the current waiting list was 11 months. Margot closed the message and opened her banking app. $2,140. She stared at the number until the train pulled into the station. Tonight's shift would pay $420, plus her share of the guests' tip pool, if there was one. She had done the arithmetic in her head so many times that she no longer had to think about it. The train carried her past rows of frozen rooftops, and in the window glass, she saw the reflection of her own face laid over the city sliding past behind her. She didn't know that inside the building she was about to enter, there was a man who would see her younger brother's name on a sheet of paper before she even had time to hang her coat on a hook. The employee entrance to the Ardenmore building was at the back, beside the garbage disposal area, and you had to ring the bell twice before anyone came to open the door. Margot rang twice. Inside, the hallway was narrow, the walls painted gray, and the smell of food from the basement kitchen drifted upward through the stairwell. She took the service elevator to the 41st floor, sharing it with 2 carts loaded with glasses and a man carrying a bin of ice. The elevator doors opened, and the building changed its face. The ceiling was 3 times higher than the one in her apartment, with polished black stone columns and a wall of glass stretching the entire length of the room, looking down over a frozen bend in the river. The white marble bar was 36 feet long, and behind it stood a 3-tier wall of liquor bottles with a brass rolling ladder. People were spreading tablecloths. Someone was testing a microphone and counting 1, 2, 3 into the empty air. Margot stopped for exactly 1 breath, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she was counting the doors. It was an old habit. The employee changing room was at the end of the east hallway, windowless, with nothing but 3 rows of metal lockers and a folding table. 38 people crowded between the rows. On the folding table sat a stack of forms and an empty plastic bin. The shift supervisor was a woman in a black polo shirt, embroidered with Voss and ivory over the left side of her chest, her hair cut short, her voice already hoarse before 7 in the morning. "Sign it and get out there," she said. "Nobody has time to wait." Margot picked up the form and read it. On the left was a space for a name. On the right were 3 blank columns, with no headings. At the bottom, printed in smaller type than everything else, was a sentence stating that the signer confirmed having received all service charges and supplemental payments in full. She read that line twice. Then she picked up the pen but didn't sign. "Nobody has done anything yet," she said. The supervisor didn't look up. "What? This says I've already received everything." "Nobody has received anything." "Then sign it and sort it out later." "If the paperwork says later that I received something I never got, what am I supposed to use when I ask about it?" 3 people standing behind Margot began looking down at the floor. Beside her stood a young server of about 22. Teddy Marsh, according to the name tag on his chest, and he said very quietly that she should just sign it and ask questions later. Margot turned her head slightly. "Ask with what?" she said. The supervisor slapped her palm against the folding table. "You're the first person in 4 months to waste my time like this. Nobody is forcing you to be here." Margot set the pen down, pulled the paper closer, and drew a straight line through the printed statement at the bottom. Beside her signature, she wrote that she had reported for work before dawn and had not received any payment. Then she signed. She did it slowly, without trying to hide anything, in front of 4 people, and she left the paper lying face up on the table, instead of handing it directly to the supervisor. The woman snatched it up and stared at the line Margot had drawn through the statement. "You like trouble, don't you?" she said. Margot pulled her gloves back on. Trouble doesn't look for people who like it, she replied. It looks for people who don't keep records. Someone behind her let out a short laugh and swallowed it almost immediately. The supervisor pointed at the plastic bin. Phones go in here. Event company policy. Margot took her phone from her pocket. Before placing it in the bin, she removed the back cover, slipped out the SIM card, and tucked it into her wallet. The supervisor saw her. What are you doing? The phone is what the company is keeping, Margot said. The number is mine. On the wall behind the folding table was an assignment sheet, printed across 3 sheets of A4 paper, 38 names, divided by work area. Margot stood reading it while adjusting the collar of her shirt. Then she took a second phone from her inside pocket. An old device used only for calls and photographs, something no one had thought to ask about, and took a picture. The flash had already been turned off. After that, she pulled out a small cardboard-covered notebook, the kind sold 3 for $1 at the corner store, and opened it to the first blank page. She wrote the first entry in block letters, short, without a single adjective. Between 2 rows of metal lockers, a woman older than Margot asked what she was writing. Things that happened, Margot said. Outside in the hallway, Gus Halloran stood in front of the assignment sheet with a clipboard in his hand, checking each line the way he did at every event. He was 47 years old, wearing a dark blue security jacket, and he had reviewed boards like this hundreds of times without ever needing to stop. He stopped at the 19th line, not at the name column. At the emergency contact column, where 2 initials and a surname had been written, W. Kessler, younger brother. He read it again. Then he looked toward the changing room door, where a woman was tying back her hair, a strip of blue wool wrapped around her left wrist. Gus stepped into the hallway, turned into the emergency stairwell where no one was standing, and dialed a phone number he hadn't saved under any name. The convoy turned off Wacker Drive just as the sun began to touch the glass of the buildings across the river. 4 black vehicles traveling with exactly the same distance between them, the second carrying Rafe Castellano. Inside the car, the heat was kept low because he didn't like the air too warm when he needed to think. Everett Crane sat across from him, 58 years old. Silver hair neatly combed, a leather briefcase worn at the corners resting on his lap. He spoke in the tone of a man describing the weather. Doyle made 2 withdrawals from the intermediary account, Everett said. The first one could have been called a mistake. The second couldn't. And last week he spent 2.5 hours in a diner in Bridgeport with someone who shouldn't know our names. Rafe didn't answer. He looked through the window, where the Ardenmore Tower was growing larger ahead of them, and he counted. Main entrance on the south side, 2 service doors in the back, one opening onto the garbage area, a rolling gate leading down to the parking garage, the eastern fire exit opening into the alley, the western one opening onto the small patch of grass between the 2 buildings. 6. Only after he had finished counting did he turn back. Does he have family? Rafe asked. Everett turned a page inside the briefcase. Wife died 4 years ago. 1 daughter. Freshman at a public university in Champaign. Rafe tapped his index finger against his knee exactly 3 times, then stopped. Pay all 4 years of her tuition in advance, he said. Pay the school directly. Don't let the money pass through his hands. Then tell him to be out of the city before dark today. Everett looked up. For a moment the car was silent, except for the sound of the tires grinding over salt on the road. You're getting too merciful, he said. Your father wouldn't have done that. Rafe looked down at his right wrist, where the cuff of his shirt covered him all the way to the joint, then straightened the cufflink. I'm not merciful, he said. I just don't want some girl growing up 10 years from now and coming to find me. Everett nodded slowly, the kind of nod a man gives when he is committing something to memory rather than agreeing with it, and closed the briefcase. The car stopped at the main entrance. The driver opened the door before Rafe could reach for the handle, and not one of the 4 vehicles turned off its engine. The Ardenmore lobby had been lit since early morning, the carpet newly laid, the flowers freshly arranged, and around 30 people were already working inside. Rafe walked in without saying a word to anyone, but the room knew anyway. The laughter of a group of floral staff near the elevators dropped by a degree, not disappearing entirely, just lowering as though someone had turned down a radio. A server carrying a tray of glasses across the main aisle caught sight of him and changed direction, circling behind the row of columns even though it added another 10 steps to her route. The building manager appeared from somewhere on the left, with both hands already clasped in front of him. No one called Rafe the boss. 4 different people greeted him within 30 seconds, and all 4 called him Mr. Castellano, including one he had already told twice that it wasn't necessary. He walked along the edge of the room instead of through the middle, an old habit, and that path carried him past the white marble bar. Behind it, 2 people were arranging glasses. One of them said something, only a few words, in a low, even voice, the kind of voice used for instruction rather than conversation. He heard it slip through the clinking of glass. Rafe slowed down. He didn't stop completely. He only turned his head toward the bar for half a second, and in that half second he couldn't figure out what he was trying to remember. He only knew that something had just touched a very old place in the back of his mind, like the moment someone smells rain rising from hot pavement and suddenly remembers a summer they can no longer name. Rafe. Everett called to him from near the elevators, lifting the leather briefcase slightly in one hand. Ashworth's people arrived earlier than expected, he said. They're waiting on the 42nd floor. Rafe turned away. He didn't look back at the bar again. Behind him, a woman with her hair tied low bent down and lifted a bin of ice with her right hand, braced its side against her left forearm, and went on with her work. Margot had the bar set up while other people were still trying to figure out where to put their coats. She arranged the glasses in neat rows, tucked the ice bin out of sight, then unrolled her gray canvas wrap across the lower shelf. Inside were a cocktail shaker, a long-handled stirring spoon, and a paring knife, all of them worn smooth along the right side of their handles. Close to noon, the kitchen rolled out a metal cart and left it at the end of the service hallway. On it were 2 trays of pastries and a pot of coffee. The pastries were left over from the day before, their tops already beginning to harden, and there was only 1 pot of coffee. 38 people stood around that cart. No one said anything for the first 30 seconds. Then one person picked up a pastry, and after that, everyone else began reaching for one too. Margot didn't take any. She opened her bag, pulled out the sandwich she had brought from home, broke it in half with her right hand, and pushed one half toward Teddy Marsh, who was standing beside her, and had been holding an empty coffee cup without pouring anything into it. He looked at the half sandwich, then at her. "What are you going to eat later?" he asked. "I'll manage," Margot replied. It was the kind of answer everyone in this city understood in 2 different ways. Teddy took it. After they had eaten, Margot walked down the east hallway looking for somewhere to empty water. And that was when she saw the door. The east emergency exit had a horizontal steel push bar, and the green sign above it was still illuminated. Someone had wrapped a chain twice around the push bar and secured it with a brass padlock. Margot stopped. She set the bucket down, reached out with her right hand, and pushed against the bar. The door moved barely more than an inch before the chain pulled tight and stopped it. She went to find the shift supervisor and told her that the east emergency exit had been chained shut. The supervisor was counting napkins and didn't look up. "Building staff are handling it," she said. "We have important guests today. They don't want anyone wandering into that passageway. If something happens, people won't be wandering," Margot said. "They'll be running." The supervisor resumed counting from the number where she had stopped and didn't answer. Half an hour later, Margot went up to the rooftop to bring down more ice bins that had been stored outside to keep them cold. The rooftop was covered by a glass canopy, and a row of freestanding patio heaters had been placed along each side, 8 of them in all, so guests could come out and take pictures with the river below without getting cold. Margot walked past them and stopped because she caught a faint smell, the kind anyone who had ever worked in an industrial kitchen recognized before they could even give it a name. She bent down and looked behind the 3rd heater. All 8 heaters were plugged into 2 extension strips, and both extension strips were plugged into a single wall outlet. The cords ran along the edge of the floor, then disappeared beneath a doormat. She held the back of her right hand close to the extension strip without touching it. It was warm, not the kind of warm electrical equipment was supposed to feel when it was running normally. Ollie Bram, the event electrician, was coiling cable in the far corner. She called him over. Ollie was about 30, thin, wearing a tool belt wider than his hips. He crouched down to look, brought 2 fingers close to the strip, then pulled them back immediately, and his expression changed. "This shouldn't be plugged in like this," he said very quietly. 8 heaters on 1 circuit. "Then unplug some of them," Margot said. Ollie looked toward the door leading back inside. "I already said that. They told me guests will be taking pictures out here, and no part of the terrace can be dark." He finished coiling the cable in his hands and said nothing more. Margot remained there for another moment. Then she went back to the changing room, opened her locker, and took the old phone from the inside pocket of her coat. She returned to the rooftop and took 4 photographs: the extension strips and the cords running beneath the mat, the backs of the row of heaters, the chain wrapped twice around the east exit push bar, the brass padlock, photographed close enough for the stamped number on its body to be clearly readable. She inserted the SIM card, emailed all 4 photographs to herself, waited until the screen showed that they had been sent, then removed the card and put it back in her wallet. After that, she took out the cardboard-covered notebook, flipped past 3 pages she had already written on, and recorded the 4th entry. East emergency exit, chain wrapped twice, brass lock, rooftop, 8 heaters on 1 electrical circuit, extension strip hot, reported to 2 people. No action taken. She closed the notebook, slipped it into her apron pocket, and went back down to the bar. Beyond the glass doors, darkness was already beginning to settle early, the way it did every January in this city, and the first cars carrying guests had begun turning into the circular drive on the south side. Guests arrived over the course of about 2 hours, and the bar went from empty to packed before Margot even had time to replace all the ice for the first time. Chadwick Mercer was the 4th person to order a drink, and the only one who came back to the bar 6 times. He was about 36 years old, wearing a navy suit with his tie already loosened early in the evening, and his family did business with the Castellano family in freight and warehouse operations, something he managed to mention twice within the first 3 sentences he said to her. By the 6th time, he could no longer stand upright without bracing one elbow against the stone counter. He set his car keys on the bar while digging through his pocket for his phone, and there they lay, a smart key with a logo on it beside his empty glass. Margot looked at the key, then she looked at him. "Do you have someone driving you home?" she asked. Chadwick laughed. "I've got a car downstairs. Pour." Margot took away the empty glass and didn't reach for the bottle. "I'm stopping here," she said. "I'll call you a car. They can be here in 7 minutes." Chadwick stared at her as though she had just spoken in another language. "What did you say?" "I'm not serving you any more alcohol tonight. Do you know who you're talking to?" "Yes," Margot said. "The man whose car key is sitting on my bar." 2 people standing nearby turned to look. Chadwick shoved the glass toward her harder than necessary, and it slid across the stone. "Pour." Margot didn't touch the glass. She reached for the house phone mounted beneath the edge of the bar and dialed the valet desk. Priscilla Voss arrived before Margot could finish her second sentence. She was 42 years old, with sharply cut platinum hair and a wine-red suit. And she moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who knew the crowd would part for her. She didn't ask what was happening. She looked at the empty glass, looked at Chadwick, then stepped behind the bar, picked up the bottle, and filled the glass right in front of Margot. She slid it across the stone toward Chadwick, and smiled at him with the face she reserved for guests. Then she turned to Margot and lowered her voice until only the 2 of them could hear. "Do you know how much that family is spending tonight?" she asked. Margot set the house phone down. "I don't know that number," she said, "but I know a human life doesn't appear on any invoice." Priscilla looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. "You're the bartender," she said. "You're not the person who decides who gets to drink." "Then don't put my name on the assignment sheet for this bar," Margot replied, "because the person whose name is on that sheet is the one who answers for it when something goes wrong." Priscilla set the bottle down very gently and walked out of the bar area without responding to the last sentence. Chadwick, meanwhile, had an audience now. He picked up his glass, turned his back to the bar, and announced loudly enough for the entire corner of the room to hear that apparently employees here were now allowed to conduct moral examinations on guests before pouring them a drink. People laughed. He went on to say that next time he would bring a medical clearance form, and the laughter grew louder. He raised his glass toward Margot like a toast, and a man at a nearby table clapped twice. Margot stood still behind the bar. She didn't argue, didn't lower her eyes, and didn't change her expression. She picked up the car key from the stone counter, walked exactly 4 steps out from behind the bar, handed it to a valet attendant standing near the door, and told him that it belonged to the guest in the navy suit, that it should be held at the front desk, and that the time it was received should be recorded. The attendant looked at her, then looked at Chadwick laughing in the middle of the room, and took the key. Margot returned to the bar, washed her hands, and continued serving the 3 guests who were waiting. When there was a brief opening between orders, she bent beneath the counter, took the cardboard-covered notebook from her apron pocket, and added another entry. She wrote that she had stopped serving a guest who had exceeded the limit, that the guest's car key had been transferred to valet services, and that the event organizer had personally continued serving alcohol to that guest after Margot refused. She didn't write a single word about the laughter. She closed the notebook, slipped it back into her pocket, looked up, and asked the next guest what they would like. Across the room, Priscilla Voss stood beside a black stone column and watched the bar a little longer than necessary for someone merely watching an employee. The private room on the 42nd floor had no windows overlooking the river, only a wall paneled in dark wood, a long table, and 8 chairs, though only 3 of them were being used that night. Rafe sat at the head of the table. Everett Crane stood beside the door with his hands clasped in front of him and didn't sit down. Frank Doyle sat in the middle, 51 years old, his coat still slightly damp across the shoulders from the snow outside, and he had already been sitting there for 10 minutes before Rafe walked in. No one invited him to take off his coat. Rafe poured 2 fingers of liquor into a glass, set the bottle down, then pushed the glass across the table until it stopped within easy reach of Doyle's hand. Doyle didn't pick it up. "I only have one question," Rafe said. His voice was lower than the hum of the air conditioning in the room, and Doyle had to lean forward to hear him. "This morning I told you to be out of the city before dark. It's dark now." Doyle licked his lips. "I need 2 more days," he said. "There are some papers at the house. How many relatives do you have in this city?" Doyle hesitated. "1 daughter. She's in school in Champaign." Rafe nodded slowly. "Today one of my people took 4 years of tuition directly to the school's financial office for your daughter. I didn't put the money in your hands because I didn't want you to have the chance to spend it." Doyle looked down at the table. "I know." "You know," Rafe said. "Then you also know I gave you a door. Not my father's door. Mine. I opened it, stepped aside, and waited for you to walk through." Doyle said nothing. Rafe reached out and adjusted the glass so it sat a little straighter, and the movement was small, but Everett shifted his stance slightly beside the door. "You didn't walk through it," Rafe said. "You stayed. And tonight you're sitting here, in the building where I'm holding my engagement party, telling me you need 2 more days. Do you understand that now I have to do what my father would have done?" Doyle's right hand, resting on the tabletop, began to tremble. It was barely noticeable, but the surface of the table was polished, and the reflection of his hand in the wood trembled with it. He brought his other hand over and pressed it down. "Mr. Castellano," he said. Rafe didn't interrupt him. He waited for Doyle to finish. "I gave them 3 names," Doyle said. "Yours wasn't one of them. I swear, your name wasn't one of them." Rafe stayed silent long enough for the air conditioning to become the loudest thing in the room. Then he said, still as quietly as before, that this was exactly the problem. Because those other 3 names belonged to 3 men who had once sat at the same table with Doyle, and every one of them had children. He said he hated what he was about to have to do, and he said it in an ordinary voice, without emphasis, without a sigh, the way someone might say they hated going to the dentist. Then he told Doyle he could stand up on his own and walk out of the room under his own power, and that Rafe's people would take him to the airport, and that he didn't have to drink the liquor sitting on the table. Doyle stood. He rose slowly, both hands braced against the edge of the table, and when he reached the door, Everett opened it for him the way he might open a door for a guest. The glass remained exactly where it was, filled 2 fingers deep, untouched by anyone. Rafe stayed seated for a while longer. He looked at the glass and turned the watch around his left wrist, half a circle, then another half, then stopped. At that same moment, 1 floor below, at the far end of the glass wall overlooking the river, Priscilla Voss stood close to the marble bar and told Margot that if she refused to pour a drink for one of Priscilla's guests one more time, she would leave that building without a single dollar, and that no one had hired her to have opinions. Margot stood straight behind the bar with both hands resting on the stone and didn't answer. When Priscilla finished, she walked away. Margot washed her hands, dried them, then turned and asked the next guest what they would like. 2 people in the same building, separated by a single floor, had both done exactly what their professions required of them that night. Only one of them had been yelled at. The staff were given a 15-minute break when the guests moved from the reception area to the dining tables, and they took it in the service hallway because the changing room had been locked for cleaning. Teddy Marsh arrived a few minutes later than everyone else, and when he came, he had a sheet of paper in his hand. He walked straight over to where Margot was leaning against the wall and held it out without saying anything. "Don't ask me where I got it," he finally said. It was sitting in the printer tray in the coordination room. The door was open. Nobody was inside. Margot took the paper and tilted it toward the hallway light. It was Voss and Ivory's staffing cost statement for that night's event, printed on one side, with a document number stamped in the upper right corner. She read from top to bottom. The first line listed 62 temporary staff members, at an hourly rate higher than the amount anyone standing in that hallway had been promised. The fourth line was staff meals, fully charged for 62 people. The ninth line was, the guest contributed tip fund, $9,400, with a note stating that it would be distributed to service staff after the event. The 11th line was the cost of the on-site medical team, 4 people, for the full shift. Margot read it a second time, more slowly than the first. Then she looked up and asked whether anyone in that hallway had seen a member of the medical staff. No one answered. A woman standing near the kitchen door said she had been moving through all 3 floors since morning and hadn't seen a single uniform with a cross on it. Ollie Bram said the medical room on the 41st floor was being used to store flowers. Teddy asked what the number 62 was supposed to mean. "There are 38 of us," someone said. 38 names on the assignment sheet. I counted them this morning. Maybe there are more people somewhere else, another person said. The list was finalized the day before yesterday, a third person replied. Nobody else came in. The hallway began to grow noisy. Someone said they should go upstairs and ask about it right now. Someone else said they needed to take a picture of the paper. Someone reminded them that their phones were sitting in the plastic bin inside the changing room that was now locked. Margot raised one hand to shoulder height, not high, and everyone went quiet. "Don't make a scene," she said. "If we march up there now, they'll take this paper back, and 10 minutes from now it won't exist anymore. Then what do we do?" Teddy asked. "Write it down," Margot said. She turned the sheet over and read the document number in the upper corner aloud. She read it one character at a time, slowly, then told everyone to repeat it back. 3 people did, then 2 more. She told them to memorize it the way they memorized their own street address, because that sheet of paper wouldn't stay in their hands, but the number could. Then she reached for the stack of spare menus sitting on a cart at the end of the hallway, tore the thick paperback covers into pieces about the size of a palm, and handed one piece to each person. "Write your name," she said. "Write the time your shift started. Write the amount you were promised, and write down who promised it. If anyone told you anything about tips, write that down too, exactly the way they said it." One woman asked what they were supposed to write with. Margot handed her own pen over and told her to pass it along. "If we make trouble now, they'll throw all of us out," an older man standing in the corner said. "I rode the train for 3 hours to get here." "They might," Margot replied. She didn't add anything to soften it. The man looked at her for a moment, then held out his hand for one of the pieces of paper. "So, what have you been writing in that notebook of yours all day?" Teddy asked. "Things that happened," Margot said. "If you keep it in your head, it's easy for someone else to deny it. If you put it on paper, they have to think a little longer." Someone gave a quiet laugh. The short kind of laugh people make when they're afraid. The last piece of paper reached Ollie, and he held it but didn't write anything right away. Margot folded the staffing cost statement into quarters and handed it back to Teddy. "Put it back exactly where you found it," she said. "Face down, the way it was when you saw it." Teddy looked at her. "Why put it back?" "Because if it disappears, they'll know immediately that somebody took it," Margot said. "And the first person they'll think of is whoever was standing closest to the printer." Teddy walked away with the paper. 3 minutes later, the bell signaling the end of the break rang from the far end of the hallway, and 38 people slipped the pieces of menu card into their pockets and returned to their positions. In Margot's apron pocket, the cardboard-covered notebook had grown thicker by one more entry. The coordination room sat behind the wall of liquor bottles, a square room containing nothing but 2 tables, a printer, and a chair Priscilla Voss hadn't sat in once since morning. She closed the door and opened her phone. The table linen supplier had sent its 4th message of the day, this time with a photograph of a letter from an attorney attached. The lighting equipment rental company said that if payment didn't arrive by the end of the week, they would come and take their equipment back in the middle of another event she was running on the north side of the city. The florist was more polite. They only asked when. And at the top, still unopened, was a message from the bank, with a subject line she had read enough times that she no longer needed to open it. Priscilla stood there and did what she always did when everything began closing in at once. She opened the business banking app and looked at a single line. the one stating that the $780,000 loan in the name of Voss and Ivory had been paid off the previous fall by a company called Halstead River Works, a name she had searched 3 times, and all 3 searches led only to a rented office in Delaware. She had never asked who was behind it. People didn't ask questions when they were drowning, and someone reached a hand beneath them. For 15 years, she had built this company from 2 folding tables and a rented van. For 15 years, she had listened to wealthy people call her the party girl, right in front of her, and she had learned that among people at this level, no one asked who was right. They only asked who would be more uncomfortable if the truth were spoken aloud. The door opened. Everett Crane walked in without knocking, closed it behind him, and stood in the middle of the room with the leather briefcase still in his hand. "You have a bartender," he said, Whitaker on the assignment sheet. Priscilla placed her phone face down on the table. "I know her. She needs to be out of this building before the party moves into the next phase," Everett said, quietly. No scene. No one watching. Priscilla folded her arms. What did she do? Everett looked at her for a moment, and in that moment he chose his words very carefully, like a man counting change. "It's an old family matter," he said. "From before you started working with us. It doesn't concern you, and it would be best if it continued not to concern you." She waited for him to say more. He didn't. "Then I'll dismiss her," Priscilla said. "I can have someone else take her place in 10 minutes. Everett nodded once, opened the door, and before leaving added that he trusted she understood why this should happen quietly, and that debts which had been erased could also be reopened. He said it in the tone of a man reminding someone about the weather. The door closed. Priscilla stood still for about 5 seconds, and during those 5 seconds she assembled a reason of her own, because people needed a reason they could look directly at. That employee had crossed out a line on a form in front of 4 people. She had refused to pour another drink for a guest from the Mercer family. She had been moving through the building since morning with a notebook in her apron pocket, and a staffing cost statement had disappeared from the printer tray during the break, only to reappear face down in exactly the same place, so neatly that it was suspicious. Priscilla didn't need Everett Crane to want her gone. She left the coordination room, walked straight to the bar, and told Margot that her shift ended there, that she should take off her apron and go downstairs. Margot set the glass she was holding into the sink. Around the bar at that moment were Teddy Marsh arranging napkins, a valet attendant waiting to collect something, the shift supervisor in the black polo shirt, and Ollie Bram coiling a cable near the base of a column. 4 people. Margot dried her hands, turned around, and spoke clearly, no louder than normal. "I need it in writing," she said. "Write down the reason you're ending my shift, the time I started, the time you're telling me to stop, and the amount I'm being paid for the work I've already done." Priscilla stared at her. "You think I have time for that?" "I think it takes 1 minute," Margot replied. "I'll stand here while you write it." The shift supervisor stopped counting napkins. The valet attendant looked down at the floor but didn't leave. Ollie straightened up. Teddy kept the entire stack of napkins in his hands and didn't dare put them down. 4 heads, 4 pairs of eyes, and 1 sentence that had just been spoken aloud in front of all of them. Priscilla Voss stood there and calculated very quickly. If she called security and had Margot dragged out now, by morning there would be 4 people who could tell the story, and one of those 4 would almost certainly file a complaint with the Labor Department. She smiled with the face she used for guests, said they would deal with it later, and walked away. That was when she began thinking of another way. The bride's waiting room was in the northeast corner of the 41st floor, with glass doors overlooking the bend in the river, and Adelaide Ashworth had been standing in front of the mirror there for nearly an hour, without saying more than 5 sentences to anyone. She was 29 years old, wearing a moss-green velvet dress, had graduated from law school, and had never once stood before a judge in court. Rafe walked in and closed the door behind him. He stopped 3 steps away from her and came no closer. "They're waiting for us out there," he said. Adelaide looked at him through the mirror. "Let me ask you something," she said. He waited. "Do you love me?" Rafe didn't answer right away. He could have lied for 3 seconds and everything would have moved forward, but he stood there and didn't, because with this woman he never had. He told her he would protect her. He told her that as long as he was alive, she would never have to ask where money came from, never have to sign a paper she didn't want to sign, never have to open a door for a stranger. He told her there was an entire world standing behind his name, and that he would stand between that world and her every day until he could no longer stand at all. Adelaide turned fully around then, no longer looking at him through the mirror. "You just named 3 things you'll do," she said. Rafe was silent. "None of those 3 things need me." He had no answer for that. She continued, her voice still gentle, without a trace of anger, and that was harder to endure than anger would have been. "I've had people protecting me my whole life. My father protected me from the family business. Priscilla protected me from everything that required a decision. Now you. I'm not saying any of you are wrong. I'm only beginning to think that if people protect someone carefully enough, eventually that person has nothing left to lose, but nothing left that truly belongs to them either." Rafe looked down at his hands. He had heard many people say many things to him over the past 10 years, and most of them wanted something from him. This didn't. Beneath the collar of her velvet dress, the silver sparrow brooch had pulled one corner of the fabric downward, and the velvet there had begun to gather into a small wrinkle. Adelaide reached up and removed it. It was far heavier than it looked. Old silver, its 2 wings folded closed, its eyes set with a dark stone. Priscilla was standing in the doorway now, holding the coordination board in one hand. Adelaide walked 3 steps toward her sister, placed the brooch in her palm, and closed Priscilla's fingers around it. "Hold this for me," she said. "It's tearing the fabric." Priscilla looked down at the brooch in her hand. "I'll put it in the box." "No," Adelaide said. "You hold it. Don't give it to anyone." Priscilla closed her hand around it. She didn't say anything else. She only nodded, and for that moment, there was no expression at all on her face. At the threshold, about 4 steps away, Nadine Corliss stood with a stack of guest lists in her hands. She was 26 years old, had worked for Voss and Ivory for 14 months, and had been standing there long enough to see everything, from the moment the brooch left the velvet to the moment Priscilla's hand closed around it. No one noticed her. People rarely noticed the person carrying the lists. Nadine wrote 1 line in the margin of the first sheet, a very short line, then turned the page over and stepped back into the hallway. The circuit breaker tripped while the guests were standing out on the rooftop taking pictures with the bend in the river behind them. All 8 patio heaters went out at the same time, and with them went the 4 decorative lights running along the railing, so for 2 seconds the entire terrace became noticeably darker than the rest of the floor. The cold air rushed in exactly the way it always did anywhere in Chicago in January when the heat was suddenly cut off. Guests began moving back inside. A few women cried out at the wind. Someone made a joke about the building's electric bill, and within a minute, the area around the bar was holding twice as many people as it had been designed for. Ollie Bram ran toward the electrical panel with a flashlight clenched between his teeth. Priscilla Voss reached the bar before Ollie even managed to open the panel cover. She didn't ask anyone a single question. She walked straight to Margot, stopped across from her on the other side of the marble counter, and said that Margot had been warned since morning about wandering around the rooftop, that she had touched things outside the scope of her job, and that now 300 guests were being forced to crowd together because of it. Margot set down the towel. "I reported that electrical line this afternoon," she said. "I reported it to 2 people. Priscilla didn't let her finish. She called over the shift supervisor in the black polo shirt and told her to put someone else behind the bar. "Take off the apron," she told Margot. "You're not standing here anymore." Margot didn't remove it. She stood straight with both hands on the stone, then extended her right hand, palm facing upward. "My answer hasn't changed," Margot said, keeping her hand extended. "If you are dismissing me, put the reason and my exact hours on paper. No record, no departure." Priscilla placed both hands on the edge of the counter and leaned forward. This time she didn't lower her voice. "Where do you think you are?" she asked. "In the building where you hired me to work," Margot replied. Priscilla let a silence hang between them, then said very slowly that there was nothing here that needed to be put in writing, that this bar belonged to her, that apron belonged to her, the name on the assignment sheet had been approved by her, and whether the employee standing in front of her understood that or didn't understand it made no difference at all. It was the first time that day she hadn't offered any reason for what she was doing. She didn't talk about the guests, didn't talk about the contract, didn't talk about who was right or wrong. She talked only about position. The shift supervisor brought another young woman behind the bar. Margot stepped out, walked past Teddy where he was standing, and didn't look at anyone. She hadn't even reached the end of the hallway when someone from the kitchen called out that a pipe beneath the large sink had come loose and water was spreading across the floor. And they called Margot's name instead of anyone else's, because she was the only person among the 38 workers there who knew where the shutoff valve was. Margot removed the apron, hung it over the back of a chair in the changing room, and went downstairs to the kitchen. She no longer had a badge, no longer had a bar, and no one had officially said she was still working. She went anyway. The changing room was empty then. Light from the hallway spilled through the crack beneath the door in a horizontal strip across the floor. A camera mounted in the upper corner of the west hallway, an older model without audio, recorded a woman in a white blouse and black skirt walking up to the changing room, opening the door, and stepping inside. Nadine Corliss remained in there for 51 seconds. During those 51 seconds, she walked directly to the chair with the charcoal apron hanging over its back, stopped for a moment, slipped a hand into the outer pocket, and touched a drawing folded into quarters, pulled her hand back out, then reached in again and placed whatever she had been holding in her palm beneath the fabric lining at the bottom of the pocket. Then she left. The camera recorded her coming out as well. Both of her hands were empty. Margot came back upstairs 20 minutes later, her sleeves wet to the elbows from crawling beneath the sink. She took the apron from the back of the chair and tied it around her waist out of habit, even though no one was assigning her work anymore, because in this line of work people tied on the apron first and figured out what came next afterward. Something pressed hard against her hip through the fabric. She reached outside the pocket and felt it once. It was hard and heavy, and she assumed it was the paring knife or the bottle opener she had hurriedly slipped in there earlier while clearing the bar. She didn't open the pocket to look. At the other end of the floor, the rooftop lights had just come back on, and a scattering of applause rose from among the guests. News of the missing brooch spread through the building faster than anything else that had happened that night. Priscilla Voss stood in the middle of the west hallway, with the empty velvet box open in one hand, and announced loudly enough for the people near the main doors to hear that no one was allowed to leave the floor. Within 4 minutes, the area had filled with a group of bridesmaids, 2 servers, the shift supervisor in the black polo shirt, and more than a dozen guests who had come out from the dining area after hearing the commotion. Gus Halloran arrived with the clipboard still in his left hand. He asked what was missing, who had been inside the bride's waiting room, and when the item had disappeared. Priscilla answered the first 2 questions and ignored the third. Then she said that the bartender had been wandering throughout the building since morning, that she had just been dismissed and was still there, and that they should start with her. Gus called Margot over. She came alone, her sleeves still wet to the elbows. The circle of people parted automatically to let her through, then closed behind her. Gus told her he needed to search her bag and apron. Margot stood still. "All right," she said. "I agree. But follow procedure." Gus looked up. "What procedure?" "Call someone from the building, not someone from Voss and Ivory. Get 2 witnesses, and one of them can't be on her payroll. Write down what you're looking for. Record the time. Then I'll open my bag." A very short silence settled over the hallway. Gus Halloran had been handling searches like this for 20 years, and he knew she was right, knew it word for word, because that morning he had sat through the building's security briefing and heard those exact instructions read aloud from a spiral-bound manual. He looked toward the far end of the hallway, where Everett Crane stood leaning against a column with his hands clasped in front of him. Then he looked down at the clipboard in his hand. "Open the bag," he said. Margot looked at him for another beat. "You know I'm right," she said. "I already told you," he replied. "Open the bag." She removed the apron, set her cloth bag on the low table someone had pulled into the middle of the hallway, and opened the zipper herself. She took out each item one by one and arranged them in a row. A pair of old, soft-soled shoes, a bottle of water, 2 pills wrapped in a tissue, a phone with a cracked screen covered in clear tape, a wallet, the cardboard-covered notebook. Nothing else. A blonde bridesmaid standing at the front folded her arms and said that in that case, she must have hidden it somewhere else. Gus pointed at the apron. Margot picked it up. With her right hand, she turned the outer pocket inside out, and the first thing that fell wasn't metal. It was a sheet of paper folded into quarters. It landed on the stone floor and opened halfway, because the creases were old, then flipped face up. On the paper was a hand drawn in colored pencil, the fingers broad and uneven, 3 of them bent inward, a pale brown mark running diagonally across the back, and beneath it a few crooked capital letters, the last word growing smaller because there hadn't been enough room. Everyone in the circle looked down at it. The blonde bridesmaid let out a short laugh. "What's that?" she asked. "Artwork?" 2 other people laughed with her. Margot bent down to pick up the paper. But Priscilla Voss stepped forward first, taking 2 long strides, and stopped there as she reached for the apron on the table. The heel of her right shoe came down on the lower left corner of the paper. It wasn't a stomp. It was only a foot placed where the paper happened to be lying, the way people stood anywhere without thinking, and she didn't look down. She turned the inner apron pocket inside out, and something silver fell onto the low table with a dry metallic sound. The sparrow brooch lay face up on the wood, its two wings folded closed. Someone behind them gasped. Several phones rose at once, but Margot didn't look at the table. "Move your foot," she said. Priscilla turned toward her. "What did you say?" "Take your foot off the paper." It was the only time all day that Margot's voice stopped being level. It wasn't louder, but it broke in the middle of a word, and everyone standing there heard where it broke. She said nothing about the brooch. She didn't say she was innocent. She didn't look at Gus, didn't look at the phones, didn't look at the silver object lying on the table less than 2 feet away. She only looked at the corner of the paper trapped beneath the other woman's heel. Priscilla looked down at her foot, saw the paper, and stepped aside with a small movement, as though brushing away dust. Then she picked up the brooch between 2 fingers and held it toward the light. Margot lowered herself onto one knee, picked up the paper with her right hand, and smoothed the crushed corner against her thigh. The corner wouldn't flatten again. She folded the paper into quarters along the old creases, stood up, and only then did she raise her eyes to Gus Halloran. They took her into the small workroom behind the kitchen, a place with a metal table, 2 plastic chairs, an old printer, and a pipe running along the ceiling that was always beaded with condensation. Part of the floor was wet because of that pipe, and no one had bothered to wipe it up. Gus Halloran stood in the doorway. Priscilla Voss sat down in the chair behind the table, as though it belonged to her. Margot remained standing. Priscilla placed a sheet of paper on the table and pushed it toward her. 3 lines had already been typed on it, stating that the undersigned acknowledged having found a piece of jewelry in the work area, placed it in a personal pocket, and forgotten to turn it in. "Sign here," Priscilla said. "You sign, and this ends in this room. No police, no report, nothing leaves the building. You go home tonight, and tomorrow no one remembers your name." Margot read all 3 lines from beginning to end. Then she read them a second time. "I didn't find it," she said. Priscilla exhaled through her nose. "Do you understand where you are? There are 300 people out there. 15 of them could make 1 phone call, and your name would never appear on another assignment sheet anywhere in this city. What exactly are you planning to trade your entire future for?" Margot set the paper back down on the table. "The very thing I'm holding," she said. "My name." Priscilla looked at her. "Have you ever been poor?" she asked. Margot didn't answer. "I have," Priscilla said, "and I know something you haven't learned yet. The name of someone like us isn't worth 1 month's rent. You sign this and you still have a month's rent. You don't sign, and you lose both." "If it were as cheap as you say," Margot replied, "you wouldn't need my signature." The sentence fell into the middle of the room, and no one picked it up. Gus Halloran shifted his stance in the doorway. Priscilla straightened in her chair. She looked down at the apron bag Margot was still holding, and saw the top corner of the cardboard-covered notebook sticking out above the edge. She stood, reached across the table, and pulled it out before Margot could react. "What have you been writing in this all day?" she asked. She flipped 1 page, then 2. She didn't read carefully. She only skimmed the short block-printed entries without adjectives, the times, the names, the notes about who had said what. Then her face changed. Priscilla closed the notebook, held it between both palms, and tore it in half. The cardboard cover wasn't thick, and it split along the spine easily enough, sending dozens of pages loose. Half fell across the metal tabletop. The rest dropped onto the wet patch of floor beneath the pipe, and the ink on the pages at the bottom began bleeding almost immediately. She threw the 2 torn pieces of cover down after them. Margot didn't move. She didn't lunge down to gather the pages, didn't cry out, didn't reach toward them. She remained exactly where she was, and looked at the papers lying on the floor for about 3 seconds. Then she raised her eyes. "You can tear paper," she said. "You can't tear up what I sent out this morning." Priscilla went still. "What?" "4 photographs," Margot said. "The rooftop and the east emergency exit. I emailed them to myself while it was still daylight, before the first guest ever walked into this building. You can take my phone. You can take my wallet too. You can't take the timestamp off that email." For the next 3 seconds, no one in the room said anything. A drop of water fell from the pipe overhead onto the wet patch of floor, Priscilla Voss looked down at the scattered pages beneath her feet, and for the first time that evening, she understood that she had just done something people would ask about later. Footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, and someone called her name. She stepped over the papers and headed for the door, and before leaving, she turned back and told Gus to take Margot out there. Let everyone see her with their own eyes. Because if she wanted witnesses, then she would give her witnesses. Gus Halloran escorted Margot out of the back room and into the center of the brilliant ballroom, forcing her to stand before 300 staring eyes. When his grip tightened, a dull pain shot straight to her shoulder. Margot didn't flinch. As Gus dragged her forward, her apron caught on the edge of a serving cart, tipping a bucket of ice over the marble floor and sending the folded drawing slipping from her pocket into the cold water. In the quiet that fell over the room, her voice carried clear and steady. "Don't lift me by the wrist. Take the weight under the elbow." Across the room, Rafe Castellano froze. The familiar words cut through the ambient noise, the exact sentence from the darkest night of his life 7 years ago. His fingers loosened, and the crystal stemware slipped, falling silently onto the thick carpet. Rafe stood up and walked toward the center of the room, the crowd parting before him. Priscilla Voss stepped into his path, holding the brooch in both hands, and began explaining smoothly that it was merely an internal staffing matter. Rafe didn't even look at the jewelry. "You're standing between me and the floor," he said, his voice so low the entire room fell dead silent. Priscilla stepped back before she even realized she was doing it. Rafe walked past her, stopped in front of Gus, and said, "Let go of her." Gus released her wrist immediately. Rafe extended his right forearm at her level and held it steady, waiting for her to take it. She placed her right hand on his forearm, shifted her weight onto it, and stood the way someone stands after years of learning to rise using only one side of the body, keeping her left shoulder completely still. There were 300 people in that room, and no one sat down. Once she was steady, Rafe withdrew his arm immediately and didn't hold on for even 1 second longer. Then he looked down at the floor. About 1 step away from where they stood, in the water spreading from the overturned bucket, a sheet of paper lay half face down and half face up. It was almost completely soaked through. Rafe walked over, knelt for the second time, and slid 4 fingers beneath the paper so he could lift it with his whole hand instead of pulling at one corner. He raised it very slowly. Water ran from the edge in 2 thin trails down the cuff of his white shirt. The colored pencil had blurred along the lower part. The block letters had bled together into a streak of color, and in the lower left corner there was a crescent-shaped indentation that the water couldn't erase. He held the paper flat across both hands and didn't fold it. Then he stood and turned to face the room. Everyone was still standing there with a glass of wine in one hand and a phone in the other. He looked across them once, from one table to the next, and he looked long enough for every person there to understand that they were being seen. Then he said, still in that same low voice, that the party was over. No one moved. He continued, saying that no one was to leave the floor, that anyone who had recorded anything was to keep the file exactly as it was on their phone and not send it anywhere, and that the building manager was to go to the security room immediately and seal all camera footage from the west hallway beginning at the start of the afternoon shift. The building manager ran toward the elevators. Priscilla Voss said he had no authority to demand footage from an internal investigation. Rafe turned his head and looked at her. "This isn't an internal investigation anymore," he said. "You just made it public in front of 300 people." At the far end of the room, beside the black stone column near the elevator exit, Everett Crane stepped away from where he had been standing and walked into the hallway, the leather briefcase still in his hand. No one noticed him. Everyone was looking at the soaked sheet of paper resting across Rafe Castellano's hands. In the mechanical basement, 2 men in maintenance jackets opened a secondary electrical panel and shut off 3 breakers in the exact order someone had written down for them on a scrap of paper. They had been told they only needed to kill the lights in the stairwell area and 2 hallways, enough to create confusion upstairs for about 10 minutes. They knew nothing about the rooftop. No one had told them that all 8 heaters up there were running on the same circuit, that the line had been running hot since the afternoon, or that once those 3 breakers went down, the entire load would be forced onto the one remaining line. The lights in the ballroom flickered once, then they went out. 300 people let out the same short sound at once. The emergency lights came on 2 seconds later, glowing a harsh red that washed across the double-height ceiling and made every face in the room look almost the same. On the rooftop, beneath the glass canopy, the extension strip under the doormat began to melt. A length of fabric draping hung along the railing slipped free from its hook and fell directly across the row of heaters. There was no explosion. First came only a plume of white smoke, thick and fast. Then the heat pushed the glass door to the rooftop open. The fire alarm screamed throughout the 41st floor. The sprinklers near the exit activated at the same time, pouring water onto the carpet, onto the dining tables, onto the shoulders of the guests standing nearby. The crowd broke apart. One woman lost a shoe and didn't stop to retrieve it. Chairs crashed over, glass shattered, and someone shouted another person's name 3 times in a row. The building's security team was on the floor below. Gus Halloran keyed his radio and heard nothing but static. 300 people in formal clothes turned toward the one place instinct told them to go. The brightest green sign in the room, the east emergency exit. They surged toward it as one body. The first person reached the door and slammed both hands against the horizontal push bar. The door moved barely more than an inch before stopping hard. The chain pulled tight and held it exactly as it had held all afternoon. The pressure of the people behind kept building. Margot stood up. She didn't shout for everyone to stay calm. She didn't say anything about not panicking. She climbed onto the nearest chair, stood straight, and shouted a direction. "East door is locked," she yelled. "Don't crowd it. Turn around." North stairwell, behind the bar, through the gap between the 2 columns. No one heard her the first time. She shouted again, slower now, separating each word, exactly the way people called instructions over machinery in an industrial kitchen. Behind the bar. "Follow my hand." She raised her right arm and pointed. 3 people turned first, then 10. Then the entire mass began changing direction like water, finding a new channel. She knew that route because she had walked it all day, had pushed ice carts through it, had wiped water from the turn in that hallway, and she knew the space between those 2 columns was wide enough for 2 people to pass side by side, even though everyone assumed it would only take 1. Rafe stood in the middle of the moving crowd and did exactly what she said. He shouted for everyone to follow the woman standing on the chair. And his was a voice the entire room had already learned to listen to, so this time they obeyed immediately. He pushed open the 2 wooden doors behind the bar and wedged them in place with 2 chairs. Smoke began spilling in from the rooftop, crawling along the ceiling in a thin gray layer. Soot streaked the white tablecloths. The air on the eastern half of the room grew hot very quickly. Margot jumped down from the chair and moved against the flow of people, heading back toward the chain door because nearly 20 people were still trapped in that corner and couldn't get out. She pushed through them, took 2 women older than herself by the hands, pulled them free of the crush, and sent them toward the bar. Then she turned back toward the door. The chain was wrapped twice around the push bar. Brass padlock, exactly where it had been that afternoon, exactly as she had written it down, exactly as it appeared in the 4 photographs she had taken. She reached out with her right hand, grabbed the chain, and pulled once. It didn't move. Ollie Bram came running from the hallway, one side of his face blackened, carrying a pair of bolt cutters he had taken from the tool cabinet on the 40th floor. He could barely catch his breath. "This is all I could find," he said. Margot took them from him. The bolt cutters were heavier than she expected. Margot opened the handles as wide as they would go, fitted the jaws around one link of the chain, and squeezed. Her right hand had strength. Her left slipped off the handle on the very first attempt, 3 fingers unable to hold their grip, and the whole tool twisted in her hands. The chain link didn't even dent. She reset it. On the second try, she changed her stance, shifted all her weight onto her right side, and drove down with her shoulder. The jaws bit into the metal but stopped halfway, and when she released the pressure, all they had left on the link was a bright mark like a scratch. On the 3rd try, she trapped the left handle between both arms, pressed down with her chest, and pushed. The cutters slipped. They hit the floor with a heavy clang, and she nearly went down with them. 20 people were trapped in that corner, and they were watching her. She picked the cutters back up. She didn't try a 4th time. "Ollie," she called. "You take this handle." Ollie Bram ran over. He was 30 years old and weighed less than 132 pounds. Margot turned the cutters around, braced the end of the left handle against a steel hinge protruding from the doorframe, forced it into place until it caught there, then held it steady with both hands. "I'll hold this side," she said. "It can't move now. You only have to force down on the other one." Ollie gripped the right handle with both hands and pulled downward. The chain link compressed a little more, then stopped. He strained again, his face turning red beneath the soot, his feet sliding on the wet floor. It wasn't enough. He was an electrician, not a strong man, and no one in that building had hired him that night for his strength. "I can't do it," he said. The smoke had dropped lower now, level with people's heads, and from the rooftop came the sound of glass cracking. Someone in the corner began to cry. Margot kept the left handle wedged against the hinge and looked up at the people behind her. "I need one more person," she said. She didn't shout. She only spoke loudly enough to be heard. "Just one more. Push down with him." For 3 seconds, no one stepped forward. Then came the sound of shoes on the wet floor, and Chadwick Mercer walked toward them. His navy suit was soaked across one shoulder. His tie had disappeared somewhere along the way, and his face was pale now, with nothing left of the man who had stood in the middle of the room laughing at her that afternoon. He didn't say anything. He only looked at the bolt cutters, then at her. "Put your shoulder into it," Margot said. "Don't pull with your arms. Put your whole weight down." Chadwick moved in behind Ollie, placed both hands over Ollie's on the cutter handle, and leaned his shoulder into it. "On 3, she said. 1, 2, 3. Both men drove downward at the same time. Margot held the left handle against the hinge with the full weight of the right side of her body. The chain link sank another halfway and gave a sharp metallic squeal. It didn't break. "Again," she said. 1, 2, 3. The second time, the jaws cut 3/4 of the way through. The cutters began slipping off the hinge, and Margot shifted her grip, driving her hip against them to hold them in place. Her left shoulder hurt so badly she had to clench her teeth, but she didn't let go. Ollie was gasping for breath. Chadwick forced out something very short through his teeth, something like "one more time." 1, 2, 3. The chain link snapped. The chain dropped to the floor in a heap with a metallic crash, and the horizontal push bar sprang free. The door flew open into the darkness of the emergency stairwell, and a rush of cold air came up from below and struck all of them in the face. The 3 of them stood there breathing. Not one of the 3 could have done it alone. "Go," Margot said. "You 2 first." She stayed at the doorway and counted every person who passed through. Her right hand braced against the door to keep it open, her left arm hanging loose at her side. 21 people. She counted them aloud. On the other side of the ballroom, Rafe Castellano was moving against the flow of people toward table 7, where an elderly woman sat leaning against the back of her chair, unable to stand. He didn't ask any questions. He took off his suit jacket, draped it around her shoulders, then crouched down with his back toward her and told her to hold on. He carried her on his back across the entire length of the room. When he reached Margot, he stopped and looked at her. "North stairwell or this door?" he asked. "This door," she replied. "The north stairwell is backed up at the landing below. Take this one, then turn left on the 39th floor. There's a passage to the service stairwell. Fewer people." Rafe did exactly as she told him. He didn't ask a single question, and in 10 years, it was the first time he had followed someone's directions without checking them first. 20 minutes later, 312 people were standing in the outdoor parking lot behind the building, under falling snow, their formal clothes soaked and soot streaked across their faces. The fire trucks arrived, then the ambulances. The medical team counted everyone 3 times, and no one was missing. 7 people needed oxygen because of smoke inhalation, including the elderly woman, and every one of them was able to speak for themselves. No one remained inside the building. Margot stood at the edge of the parking lot, one hand holding her left shoulder, her hair stuck to her forehead, looking up at the 41st floor, where the emergency lights were still glowing red through the glass. Chadwick Mercer stood about 10 feet away with both hands braced on his knees, and when he finally looked up, he looked toward her but couldn't say anything. That was when someone draped a silver emergency blanket over Margot's shoulders and told her to follow them to the ambulance at the west entrance. 2 men in dark coats stood beside her, one holding a radio, the other saying that an ambulance was waiting at the west entrance and that her shoulder needed to be imaged immediately. They stood on either side of her. They didn't grab her arms, didn't shove her, didn't do anything that the 300 people standing in the parking lot could look at and find strange. Margot looked toward the west entrance. There were no ambulance lights there. She went with them. She went because if she shouted in the middle of that parking lot, 30 people would turn around. The 2 men beside her would smile, and someone would say that a woman who had just been through a fire was naturally panicking, and she had lived long enough to know exactly how much someone like her would be believed when a story had 2 sides. So she walked. But she did something else. The gray canvas roll she had grabbed while running past the bar was still over her shoulder, the roll containing the cocktail shaker, the long-handled stirring spoon, and the paring knife. When they led her into the service elevator at the corner of the parking garage, she let it slide from her shoulder and fall onto the elevator floor, then used her foot to push it against the gap at the door. One of the men turned to look. "My shoulder," she said. He didn't pick it up. The other man pressed the button for basement level 2. Margot leaned against the elevator wall, and just as the doors began to close, she raised her right hand toward the control panel as though she were looking for something to steady herself against, and pressed the button for basement level 3 as well. The elevator stopped at basement 2. Then it moved down one more level and opened at basement 3, and both men were irritated by it, one of them swearing about the building's old elevator. The canvas roll was still caught in the doorway. It held the doors open for exactly 4 seconds, before one of the men kicked it out into the hallway. Basement 3 was the employee parking level, with a low ceiling, fluorescent lights running in rows overhead, 3 of them flickering because of the damp. Everett Crane stood beside a black car with its engine already running and the rear door open. He was still holding the leather briefcase. He looked at Margot and said she should get into the car, that there were too many people around tonight, and that some things were better discussed somewhere quieter. Margot stood 3 steps from the car and didn't move any closer. "You know my real name," she said. Everett didn't deny it. Overhead, one fluorescent light flickered twice, then steadied. Then came the sound of the elevator doors opening behind them. Rafe Castellano stepped out, his white shirt wet and streaked with soot at the cuffs, and in his hand was the gray canvas roll. 4 of his men were behind him. No one said anything for about 3 seconds. The black car kept idling. Rafe looked at Everett Crane, then at the 2 men standing on either side of Margot, then at the open rear door of the car. He set the canvas roll on the hood of the nearest vehicle. "Close the car door," he said. The driver closed it. The sound of the door shutting was louder than usual in the underground garage, echoing back from 3 directions. Rafe walked forward. He moved very slowly and looked at no one except Everett. His 4 men spread out behind him. The 2 men beside Margot stepped back once, then again, and one of them slipped a hand inside his coat. Rafe said one word. He said it very quietly, quieter than the sound of the idling engine, and the man pulled his hand back out of his coat and let it fall to his side. No one in that parking garage moved after that. Rafe stopped in front of Everett Crane. He didn't raise his voice. He only asked how long Everett had known her. Everett didn't answer. Rafe nodded once, as though the silence itself were an answer, then motioned to 2 of his men. Margot stepped forward. She moved around them and placed herself in the middle, touching no one, both hands hanging openly at her sides where everyone could see them. "Don't," she said. Rafe turned to look at her. "This isn't your matter anymore," he said. "It's been my matter since before you ever knew my face," Margot replied. Then she said the sentence she had been thinking all the way down in the elevator. "If you do what you're about to do here, then tomorrow they'll ask me about it, and I'll have to sit at a table and give a statement about the very person I saved that winter. I already paid once for telling the truth. Don't make me choose again." In the parking garage, the fluorescent light above them flickered twice more, then went out completely, and the only light left came from the headlights of the idling car. Rafe stood still for a very long time. Then he took his phone from his pocket and dialed 3 digits. The police arrived close to midnight, and they used the conference room on the 38th floor to take statements because the 41st floor had been sealed off. People were called in one at a time. Priscilla Voss went in first, came out 15 minutes later, and sat down in a chair in the hallway with both hands resting on her knees. Nadine Corliss sat 4 chairs away from her. She had been sitting there for more than an hour without speaking to anyone, and on her lap was a phone lying face down. When they called her name, she stood, went inside, and before anyone had time to ask the first question, she placed the phone on the table and said she wanted to submit 2 things. The first was a recorded voice message. She played it, and Priscilla Voss's voice came through the phone speaker, slightly distorted, telling her to go into the employee changing room, find the charcoal apron hanging over the back of a chair, place what she was holding into the inner pocket beneath the fabric lining, leave immediately, take nothing with her, and tell no one. The recording was less than 20 seconds long. The second was 11 screenshots. They showed the payment history for Voss and Ivory's business account, photographed from the desktop computer in the coordination room, with the dates still visible in the corner of the screen. The first image showed the $780,000 loan that had been paid off by an entity called Halstead River Works. The next 7 showed smaller, regular transfers from the same source, continuing from the previous fall. The final 3 showed email exchanges between Priscilla and an address, with no person's name attached to it, only a string of characters. The investigator asked how long Nadine had been keeping these things. Nadine told the truth. She said she had taken the screenshots weeks earlier, before anything had happened in this building. They asked why. She sat quietly for a moment, then said she had worked for the company for 14 months, that she had seen how unpleasant matters were handled, and that she knew with certainty that if the day ever came when everything broke apart, the first person they would put forward would be the youngest one without a long-term contract. "I didn't keep them because I'm a good person," she said. "I kept them because I was afraid." No one in the room said anything about that. They asked who had given her the brooch. She gave them Priscilla Voss's name. They asked whether Priscilla had explained why. Nadine said she had only been told that the bartender needed to be out of the building that night and that there couldn't be any noise about it. Then she added one detail no one had asked for. She said that when Priscilla told her that, she had been standing in the west hallway, and a silver-haired man carrying a leather briefcase had left that spot less than 30 seconds earlier. Everett Crane was brought into the room close to 1 o'clock in the morning. He didn't object, didn't call a lawyer immediately, and sat down with the posture of a man who had spent 30 years sitting in rooms like this one. He said he was the Castellano family's longtime legal advisor, that he knew nothing about a brooch, and that he had been there that night only as a guest. They placed a printed copy of Halstead River Works' business registration on the table in front of him. He looked at it and said nothing more for 4 minutes. Priscilla Voss was called in a second time at 1:20 in the morning. They played the voice message for her again. She sat straight and said she would wait for her lawyer. Then they placed the printed Halstead River Works registration on the table beside another sheet showing the name of the entity's ultimate beneficiary. Priscilla read the line. She read it once, then bent closer and read it again, more slowly. And before she could open her mouth to say anything, her face had already changed. Not in the way a frightened face changes. It seemed to collapse inward, like something that had suddenly had all the air drawn out of it. 15 years building a company from 2 folding tables. 15 years listening to people call her the party girl. And on the night someone had reached a hand beneath her while she was drowning, she hadn't asked a single question. Now she sat in that room and understood that no one had rescued her. They had bought her, and the thing they had needed her to do, the thing she had believed was meant to protect a few numbers on her own staffing statement, had never really been about money at all. She looked up and asked the investigator only one question, her voice suddenly gone hoarse. "Who is she?" Priscilla asked. "Who is she really?" No one answered her. Gus Halloran went into the room close to 2 o'clock in the morning and sat down before anyone had a chance to invite him to. He placed the clipboard on the table, rested both hands on either side of it, and said he didn't need anyone to ask questions. He would start from the beginning. He said that morning he had reviewed the assignment sheet the way he did at every other event, and he had stopped at the 19th line, not at the name column, but at the emergency contact column, where 2 initials and a surname had been written. He said he had carried that surname in his head for 7 years. They asked what he did next. He said he went into the hallway, stepped into the emergency stairwell, and called Everett Crane. They asked what Everett Crane told him. He said Everett told him to stay where he was, observe, and wait. They asked whether any other instruction came after that. He said yes. He said he was told that if an opportunity came to get that woman out of the building, he should take it and not ask questions. He said he had conducted the search without a building representative, without an independent witness, and without making a written record, even though the woman being searched had asked for all 3, and had asked for them using the exact language printed in the procedure manual he himself had reviewed that very morning. They asked why he did it anyway. Gus Halloran looked down at his right hand resting on the table. Then he told them the rest. He said that 7 years earlier, on a February night, he had been one of 2 men standing outside a small bar in the South Loop. He said the place was called the Sparrow. He said he hadn't known anyone was inside except the person they were looking for. He said the bar had a steel door with a narrow gap, and when he kicked that door, there had been a hand braced inside the opening. He said he had felt it beneath his foot. He said he kicked the door again. Then he stopped. He looked at his own hand for a while longer, and after that he said that earlier that afternoon, when he had grabbed the woman's left wrist to pull her to her feet in front of 300 people, he hadn't realized it was the same hand. After he said that, he couldn't speak again for a very long time. No one in the room hurried him. That night at the Sparrow, the bar had 7 stools and a broken pool table, and Margot Whittaker, who was 21 then and still used the surname Kessler, had been turning chairs upside down on the tables to close for the night. The young man who came in didn't ask for help. He only asked whether the bar had a back door. His coat was soaked through on one side near the hip, and his face was white. She locked the front door, turned off the sign, and pulled him down behind the bar because it was the only place in the room that couldn't be seen from outside through the glass. She folded a stack of bar towels into a thick pad and pressed it against the wound, then made him keep talking. She asked what street he had grown up on. She asked what kind of liquor he hated. She asked whether he had any brothers or sisters. And whenever his eyes started to close, she called out the name of the street he had just told her, and asked him the question again, over and over. When someone knocked on the glass, she gestured that the bar was closed. Then she opened the door, stepped outside into the cold, bent down to wipe away the water on the front step, and went back inside. She locked the door again. That was when the door was kicked, and she held it shut with her body and with her left hand pushed into the narrow gap as she reached for the safety latch near the bottom. She held it for another 11 seconds. The latch caught. When the ambulance arrived, she didn't go with him. She stayed behind and cleaned the floor, because if the owner came in the next morning and saw the stain, she would lose her job. She lost the job anyway. The investigator asked Gus Halloran why he hadn't said any of this sooner, for example, that afternoon. He answered that he hadn't looked closely enough that afternoon. He said that in 20 years of doing this kind of work, he had learned to look at name badges instead of people's faces, and that was what allowed him to do his job without having to think too much. Then he said one last thing before signing the statement. He said that when he had been ordered to take her away, he had told himself he was only following instructions, and that for the past 7 years, he had told himself the exact same thing about the night at the Sparrow. He said that once he heard himself say it out loud, it sounded much smaller than it ever had inside his head. It was nearly dawn when they let her leave, and Rafe Castellano was waiting at the south exit with only 1 car, the other 3 nowhere in sight. He opened the rear door and said nothing until they had driven 3 blocks. Then he opened the compartment beneath the seat, took out a thin blue folder, and placed it in the empty space between them. Margot didn't pick it up right away. She looked at it for a moment before opening it. Inside was a bound list printed on a 4-paper, names and addresses and places of employment arranged by state: Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Missouri, Ohio. She turned to the final page of the numbered section and saw the number 211. Every name belonged to a woman named Margot, who had once worked in the service industry. Beside each name was a handwritten mark. Some names had a single straight line drawn through them. Some had been circled and then crossed out. On the 9th page, one name had been crossed out, written again in the margin, crossed out once more, then written again in different ink. She kept turning pages. The last page was blank, nothing on it but a few ruled lines. "I was looking under the wrong last name," Rafe said. "For 7 years I searched for a name you had already stopped using before I even began looking." Margot closed the folder and rested her hand on the cover. "I took my mother's last name," she said. "I changed it because after that night, no one would hire me anywhere." She said nothing more about it. Outside the window, the city was still dark, and garbage trucks were moving along the curb. She asked him one question. "Why did he find me before you did?" Rafe looked out the window. He was silent so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said that 3 years earlier, he had bought the Ardenmore building. He said it had been a terrible business decision, that the building was old, had lost money for 4 years in a row, and sat in the wrong location for almost everything people wanted from a property like that. He said he bought it because from the south-facing glass on the 41st floor, if you stood in exactly the right place, you could look down at the intersection where a 7-stool bar had once stood. The bar had been closed for years. Now there was a laundromat there. He said he had never explained that to anyone, and that only one person had ever asked why he bought the building, and that person had spent 10 years sitting across from him in cars. So when I chose it for the engagement party, Everett Crane understood that night had never really been buried, Rafe said, and he started looking. He had more people than I did, and he knew what kind of person to search for. The car stopped at a red light. Rafe continued, saying he wanted to arrange a place for her to stay, that his company had an empty apartment on the north side, and that there would also be compensation transferred into any account she gave him. Margot shook her head before he finished the second sentence. No, she said. Rafe turned toward her. You haven't heard all of it. I've heard enough, she said. Pay the 38 people for their work. Pay for the treatment on my shoulder. Leave the rest alone. Why? Because if I take an apartment from you tonight, then tomorrow someone will say I was paid to say everything I said. And because 7 years ago, I didn't pull you behind that bar and put a price of one house on what I was doing for the future. Rafe had no answer to that. Then what do you want? He asked. Margot looked directly at him. Call the police, she said. Not your way, their way. He went still. I already called them, down in the garage. I know. I want you to call them again and finish it properly. Give them everything your company has. The books, the contracts, that company in Delaware, everything. Tomorrow you're going to have 10 people telling you not to do it. Rafe looked at her. Do you understand what you're asking me to do? I do, she said. If you handle this your way, then in the records of that building, for the rest of my life, I'll still be the bartender who was caught with something in her apron pocket. I don't need you to avenge me. I need a piece of paper saying I didn't take it. The light turned green. The car continued for a long stretch in silence. Then Rafe Castellano took out his phone and dialed a number, and in all 34 years of his life, it was the first time he had ever called them willingly. What happened afterward unfolded slowly, and none of it was graceful. Voss and Ivory lost its 3-year contract with the Castellano Group within a week, then lost 4 more clients over the course of that month, not because anyone made a public announcement, but because people simply stopped returning calls. Priscilla Voss sold the company vehicle, then sold most of the equipment in the warehouse, and eventually moved the office into a ground-floor space on the west side of the city with 2 employees. She didn't kneel anywhere, and no one filmed her. What happened to her was much simpler than that. The phone stopped ringing. Everett Crane went to trial that fall, and the proceedings lasted longer than anyone had predicted, because the records Rafe's company turned over were so extensive, they had to be divided into 17 separate volumes. Gus Halloran was suspended that very night and never returned to a supervisory position. He went back through the procedures, retook his certification exam, and 3 months later, at another event in the city, an important guest demanded that he search a server's bag on the spot without calling anyone else down. Gus Halloran said no. The guest shouted at him. Gus called the venue manager and stood there waiting. No one applauded him. The rule was simply followed, and that was all that happened. Adelaide Ashworth ended the engagement 6 weeks later, and she didn't end it because Rafe had done anything wrong. She told him that her entire life, someone had always protected her, and that she wanted, for once, to make a decision entirely on her own. Even if it turned out to be the wrong one, they parted as friends, and it was the first act of freedom either of them had made. Margot accepted the money for her shoulder treatment, and nothing more. When Rafe offered to pay for her younger brother's new hearing aids, she refused on instinct, and he didn't press her. He only told her that 7 years earlier, she had taken the entire cost in his place without asking him a single question, that she had taken away his right to repay her, and now he wanted to know whether she intended to take away her brother's right to hear as well. 3 days later, she signed a term loan agreement, filled in the interest rate herself in the blank space, and Rafe signed beneath it without changing a word. She took the service industry safety certification exam in the spring, failed the first time on the chemical storage section, brought every bottle and container in her apartment out, and spent 2 weeks reading every label, then took the exam again and passed. After that, she built a set of rules for temporary staff working at event venues. It contained 19 provisions, exactly the same number of entries that had been in the cardboard-covered notebook torn apart that night, and she named it the 38 Standard, after the number of workers who had been in the building that evening. 11 venues in Chicago adopted it during the first year. More than a year later, the 41st floor of the Ardmore opened for a training session. There were no chandeliers, no flowers, only folding tables, bottled water, and a stack of printed materials. A 20-year-old woman named Bonnie Alcott had just finished mopping the section of floor near the entrance and placed a warning sign down. Rafe Castellano came walking toward it, distracted by a conversation, and nearly stepped around the sign. Bonnie raised one hand. "Excuse me, the floor is still wet." Rafe stopped and took a full step backward. "Thank you, Bonnie." The young woman looked surprised that he knew her name. Out in the hallway, Wesley Whitaker, now 10 years old and wearing his new hearing aids, was talking excitedly about the coffee machine in the corner of the room and how it sounded like a little train. Rafe crouched down until he was level with the boy's eyes, raised both hands, and signed to him. Slowly. He got 2 signs wrong. Wesley corrected him and burst out laughing. Margot stood at the end of the hallway and watched them longer than she needed to. "When did you start learning?" she asked. "From the first day," Rafe replied. "You wouldn't let me repay what I owed you. You never said anything about repaying your brother." Margot lifted her hand to her left wrist, removed the blue wool band, and slipped it into her pocket. Not because the scar had disappeared, because she no longer needed to hide it. On the wall behind them, inside a simple wooden frame, hung a colored pencil drawing with the words at the bottom blurred away and one corner torn. Rafe had never allowed anyone to restore it. He said some things should be returned exactly as they were when they were damaged, so no one could ever forget that they had once been damaged at all. The most painful thing about that night wasn't the missing piece of jewelry. It was that 312 educated people had immediately believed a bartender could be guilty without anyone proving a thing. Margot Whittaker didn't become more worthy the moment a powerful man spoke her name. She had been the same human being since before dawn, when she poured cocoa for her brother and folded a drawing into the pocket of her coat. People simply hadn't looked closely enough. An accusation is not evidence. Poverty is not a crime. And a uniform can never erase a human being's right to be treated with dignity. If today you hold even the smallest amount of power over someone else, use it to look more carefully, not to judge more quickly. If this story touched you, please leave a like, share it with the person you're thinking of, and subscribe to our channel so you can hear more meaningful stories every day. How did tonight's story make you feel? And if you have ever stood where Margot stood, or witnessed something like this yourself, leave us a comment. We sincerely want to hear what is in your heart. May you and your family always have good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.